Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another Victober video. And today I thought I would tell you about my absolute favourite Victorian novels. So I'm very excited to make this video. I have made a video once before on my channel telling you about my favourite Victorian novels, but that was way back in 2016, and quite a lot of things have changed. There are some extra books that I have read since then that I really adore, and there are some books that have like shot way up my ranking when I've reread them or that I've just thought about more. So I thought I would make a new video telling you about my favourite Victorian novels. I'm calling them all novels. There are a couple of novellas in here, but I have 25 books to talk about, all of which I completely adore. So I'm going to try really hard not to make this video eternally long, but we're gonna see how we go. At number 25, I have Hester by Margaret Oliphant. This is a book I read earlier this year and just completely fell in love with. It tells the story of a young woman called Hester who moves to a new town with her mother, and in this town lives a relation of theirs, Catherine, who is quite an imposing figure and also runs the local bank. Catherine has been running the bank for a long time, and her two nephews are also involved in the running of it, and Hester kind of gets slightly potentially romantically caught up with the two nephews, but also Hester and Catherine have this like really tense and complicated relationship. One of the things I loved about Hester was that I found it like really proto-feminist and really exciting in the way it kind of looked at the position of women in late Victorian society, but it's also beautifully written and really compelling. I loved the characterization in it and the character relationship, so Hester is absolutely a novel I recommend. I have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is a late 19th century Gothic novel that is really compelling and really powerful and really intriguing. It tells the story of a young man called Dorian Gray who at the beginning of the book has a portrait painted of him, and something weird happens where the portrait ages and Dorian Gray doesn't age. Dorian at the beginning of the book is a kind of very pure, uncorrupted soul in some ways, but we watch him over the course of the novel become sort of more and more corrupted by the society and the people around him. It is a fascinating exploration of upper class society and kind of hedonism in the late Victorian age, and it's also just really witty. It is such a powerful novel and definitely one I recommend. At number 23, we have The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This is a wonderful Victorian novel that I absolutely love. This narrative starts out from the perspective of a young man called Gilbert Markham, who's living in a kind of small rural area when a new tenant, a new person appears in the neighbourhood. Her name is Mrs. Graham. She's a widow with a young son, and no one really knows anything about her. And the novel kind of follows Gilbert's growing relationship with her, and then in like the middle section of the book we get to hear about her past and her life. It's a really proto-feminist novel in many ways, and there are so many things about it which I just find utterly compelling and truly fascinating. The next book I want to mention is A Dark Night's Work by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is one of Gaskell's novellas and it's one I absolutely love. It's out of print and very underrated, but it's really brilliant and I definitely recommend it. It tells the story of a young woman who is growing up living a fairly ordinary life. She lives with her father, who is a widower, and she recently met a man who she's falling in love with. They're thinking about getting married. Her life seems set for her, and then one night something happens that changes everything, and the book goes on from there in all kinds of twisty, exciting directions that I didn't expect. It is such a good novella, beautifully written, really fantastically explored with a truly fantastic plot and just like a cracking Gaskell twist. At number 21, I have The Egoist by George Meredith. This is a truly brilliant Victorian book, but it is definitely not one for Victorian beginners. This, I would say, is the most difficult Victorian book I've read in terms of the language. It is very dense and a bit impenetrable, but also, once you do manage to get through the surface, it is truly brilliant. And also one of the most like powerful and interesting explorations of gender and gender power dynamics within the Victorian period. It tells the story of a man called Sir Willoughby who, towards the beginning of the novel, forms an engagement with a young woman called Clara. And not long after their engagement, Clara begins to realise that he is definitely not the man for her and that they are never going to be happy together. And so she tries to extract herself from their engagement and he won't let her. And the novel basically follows like the complicated power play between them as she tries to get out of their engagement. And it is just fantastic, such a brilliant exploration of Victorian gender. I really want to reread this one because it is very dense and I'm sure I didn't get everything out of it that I could have got the first time, but it is truly brilliant. At number 20, I have Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is an industrial novel set in Manchester following a young girl called Mary Barton. She is a seamstress and she's kind of torn between two very different suitors, one man who is of her own class and one man who is a mill owner's son from the class above her. And then you think you know where this book's going, and then then halfway through something happens that is very dramatic, bit like A Dark Knight's work, and just everything changes and the rest of the novel is just so tense and amazing. It's a truly fantastic book. I love the way it explores industrialisation and the life of the working classes in Manchester in the Victorian period. It's got wonderful characters, a really cracking plot, and yeah, just highly recommend this one. At number 19, I have Far from the Madden Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This is a brilliant novel which I absolutely love. It tells a story of a young woman called Bathsheba Everdeen, who at the beginning of this novel inherits a farm from her uncle. She goes to this farm and everyone is a bit surprised to see a woman running a farm, but she decides to really take it in her stride. And we follow her life running this farm and also her relationships with three very different men who arrive as suitors to her. There are so many things I love about Far from the Madden Crowd. I love Hardy's writing style, and his novels are always going to be thoroughly enjoyable for me, but I also love the characterization in this novel. Bathsheba is such an interesting character, and the exploration of her role running the farm and how the men around her react to a woman being a farmer is just fantastic and really interesting. If you're spotting a pattern between all of these books, I do enjoy a Victorian novel that explores gender in a really interesting way. I also think the love story in this is fantastic, and the ending of this novel I find so interesting and just so interesting to think about again and again. I would also say that this is a great place to start with Thomas Hardy because I think it is one of his more accessible novels and one of his less completely depressing novels. So yeah, definitely a brilliant read and one I really recommend. At number 18, I have another Thomas Hardy, and that is Judy Obscure. I always find it really hard to pick my favourite Thomas Hardy, so I thought I would just do these back to back. I think my favourite Thomas Hardy is Judy Obscure because I do think it is truly fantastic, but it is quite hard-hitting and a little bit depressing. And I wouldn't recommend starting with it. This tells the story of Jude from his childhood into his adulthood. Jude is a working class boy who desperately from his youngest years wants to go to university. He wants to be a scholar, he loves learning, but because of his class background he isn't able to do that. So he ends up becoming a stonemason. We follow Jude throughout his life, his romantic relationships, his family ties, and his complicated relationship with his career and what he really wants to do with his life. This is such an amazing novel. I think it's one of the most interesting novels I've read in terms of writing about class and sort of the lack of opportunities for particular people within the Victorian period. It is truly wonderfully written and incredibly moving. I love the love story in this so much, and though there is a lot of darkness in this book, I also think that the moments of happiness that you get between all the bleak stuff are just so beautiful. It's so good. I highly recommend it. Like I said, not a first Hardy novel, but it's so good. At number 17, another rather dismal Victorian novel. This is The Netherworld by George Gissing. This tells the story of various working class characters in late 19th century London, focusing on their kind of difficulty getting work, struggling with their poverty and their kind of relationships with each other. And the two main characters are a young girl called Jane Snowdon, who at the very beginning of the novel is kind of rescued from an awful situation when her grandfather comes back into her life. And then we also follow a young man called Sydney, who is a friend of the Snowdon family. I love so much about this book. I think it is truly beautiful and just magnificent. George Gissing, like Thomas Hardy, writes fantastically about working class life and poverty within the Victorian period, but also, like Thomas Hardy, he is quite bleak and his novels can be a little bit heart-wrenching, but also truly amazing. I think this book might have one of the most moving scenes in all of Victorian literature. There's just some incredibly powerful moments in this. I've read The Netherworld twice, and both times I just absolutely adored it. I think it is such an incredible novel about class and money and struggles and the difficulty of life for so many people in the Victorian period. It's just amazing and I cannot recommend it enough. At number 16, we have David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This tells the story of a man called David Copperfield from his childhood into his adulthood. David has a happy childhood living with his widowed mother, but everything changes when his mother remarries. And from that point onwards, we follow David in his life of flux, moving between the middle and the working classes, struggling with work, going to school, trying to develop a career as a novelist. We follow his romantic relationships, his family relationships, and so much more. I love David Copperfield. I think it is a truly wonderful coming of age story, and it also has some of the most wonderful characters in Dickens's books. There are so many amazing, complex, wonderful characters, and I absolutely love it. At number 15, another Dickens book, I have Bleak House. This is a truly amazing novel, and in it we follow various characters and various plot lines, all kind of connected by this specific court case case Jarndyce and Jarndyce, where disputed will has been in the Chancery courts for generations and generations, meaning tons of families have been affected. It is a really fascinating novel, really powerful, with fantastic characters and really, really interesting themes. It is at its heart, in many ways, a social critique novel, and I love so many things about it. One thing that I especially love about it is its really interesting structure. Half the narrative is told in third person past tense by one of the main characters, Hester, and then the other half of the narrative is told in third person present tense, and kind of flits between various different characters and has quite a different narrative voice. So I think it's one of Dickens's like most interesting novels writing wise, and yeah, just a truly fantastic novel. Such a beast, but just yeah, so amazing. I highly recommend it. At number 14 I have The Half Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury. This is a fantastic novel which tells the story of Alice and Bianca. Alice has lived a very respectable middle class life with her two parents who are married, but she doesn't know that her father had an extramarital affair that resulted in a daughter, Bianca, who is Alice's half sister. Bianca has grown up poor with a position in life well below Alice's, and she decides at the beginning of the novel to become an actress, and fate brings Bianca and Alice together. They don't know they're sisters, but they form a friendship, and everything kind of goes on from there. I love this novel so much. I think it is such an incredible examination of the position of women in Victorian society, and also a fantastic examination of class and respectability, where we follow these two sisters who have completely different lives in completely different classes, and look at the different options that are open to them. And I love how this book looks at like middle class respectability in the Victorian period and what it means, and how respectability is so often a performance, and is Alice the middle class respectable woman with her very like respectable life on the surface, and maybe she's actually less respectable when it comes down to it than Bianca, who's an actress who is considered unrespectable. It's so good, it's so good. I highly recommend this book. At number 13 I have A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is a wonderful novella which tells the story of a man called Scrooge who's not very nice, who one Christmas night is visited by 4 ghosts who teach him to change his ways and possibly become a nicer person. I love A Christmas Carol so much. It is a bit cheesy, it's got all its moral messages right on the surface, but I love it so much for pure enjoyment. I love it for its Christmassy spirit, and I love the writing as well. It's so beautifully written with so many wonderful phrases, so many clever moments, so many beautiful passages, and I feel like sometimes when I don't have the time to read a giant 1,000-page Dickens tome, reading A Christmas Carol just gives me that like hit of Charles Dickens that I need. It is so good, it is so amazing. Yes, I love it so much. At number 12 I have The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. This novel tells a story of various characters, most of them based in London, and all kind of centering around this family who move into London at the beginning of the book called the Melmottes. Mr. Melmotte seems to have come from abroad. He has a giant fortune, but no one knows where it comes from. He's moved into a house with his wife and his daughter. No one knows anything about them except that they have money, and so everyone in London society flocks to them. And we follow various characters who are all kind of linked by the Melmottes, and this really is at its heart a book about money, but it's also a book about marriage, and it's also a book about family, and it's also a book about love and like complicated nuance in people's characters. It's so good, it's so amazing, and I love this book a lot. At number 11 I have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Jane Eyre will always hold a giant place in my heart for being the novel that got me into Victorian literature. I read Jane Eyre at the age of 13 and I was just blown away, and after that I just kept on reading Victorian literature over and over again and again. Jane Eyre is a wonderful novel. It is a coming of age story that follows our heroine Jane Eyre from her childhood into her adulthood. We follow her unhappy life living with an aunt who does not want her. We follow her life at school, and then we follow her life when she becomes a governess and moves to the mysterious Thornfield Hall, where her master is a man called Mr. Rochester, who she may or may not fall a little bit in love with. I love Jane Eyre so much. It is a truly fantastic novel. I think it is beautiful, I think it is clever, I think the dialogue in it is just so good. Like the Victorian flirting in Jane Eyre, you know, it's just fantastic. I love the richness of the language. I love the compelling plot and the twists and turns within it. I love Jane Eyre's character so much, and I love the way that this book is a coming of age story. I love the way that Jane, like, you know, holds on to her right for happiness and is willing to like proclaim to all the world that she has a right to a life as much as anyone, even though she is sort of shy and introverted, even though she feels that she is little and obscure and not important in the world. She still like claims her right to a life that is worth something, and I love that about Jane Eyre so much. It is so good. It is so good. It's just, yeah, I love it a lot. At number 10, I have Valet, also by Charlotte Bronte. I love Valet hugely. I think I love it more than Jane Eyre, and it's just so good. And I feel like for anyone who loves Jane Eyre but is slightly disappointed by the end of Jane Eyre, I feel like Valet is a good one to read for being a little bit different. Valet tells the story of a young woman called Lucy Snow, who after having lost all of her family, moves from England to Belgium in order to become a teacher in a small town there. At first, she isn't able to get a job as a teacher, so she becomes a nursery maid, and we follow her life and her career there and her relationship with various people in the school. It is in many ways a story of unrequited love, but it's also a story of like self-determination and coming into your own, of being a stranger in a place where you don't know anyone, you don't know the customs, you don't know the world, but you're there to make something of your life. It's a story about, you know, like Jane Eyre, self-determination and claiming a life for yourself and claiming the right to a life for yourself. I love it so much. It's so good. At number 9, I have The Odd Women by George Gissing. This is a wonderful late 19th century proto-feminist Victorian novel, which is all about the position of women in late Victorian society, and also about like the kind of movement for female emancipation and better life opportunities for women that's happening in the late Victorian period. We focus on a few different female characters, all with very different lives. There are the Madden sisters, Alice and Virginia, who live in a deep poverty, really struggling to get by. And we also follow their sister Monica, who works as a shop girl, working incredibly long shifts in a job that she hates. But then we also follow Rhoda Nunn and Mary Barfoot, who run a typewriting school for women, where they are trying to educate women to get better lives, better jobs, and kind of create new opportunities for women. They are incredibly feminist, and they really want a social revolution. They really want to change the world, and especially how the world treats and reacts to women. It's such an incredible novel. It's proto-feminist and amazing, and I love it so much. I think it is incredible, and I love how different it is as a Victorian novel. I love the ending. I love how this takes lots of the things you expect in a Victorian novel and turns them on its head. I love the social criticism in this, but I also love how this is a novel which could have been just a manifesto, which is also a fantastic story with amazing characters and like so much packed into quite a short book. It's so good. It just, yeah. It is amazing. At number 8, I have Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. This novel tells the story of Amy Dorrit, who lives in the Marshalsea prison for debtors with her father. Her father is in prison for debt. Amy is not in prison. She can leave the prison complex, but she returns every night to stay with her father and the rest of her family. And then during the day, she goes out to work. She works as a seamstress for a woman called Mrs. Clennam. And at the beginning of the novel, Mrs. Clennam's son, Arthur, comes back from abroad, and Amy and him meet and form a friendship, and this ends up changing Amy's life forever. It is such a brilliant novel. I love it so much. It has probably my favourite love story in a Dickens novel, as well as having fantastic themes and a wonderful exploration of class and money. But I also love Amy Dorrit as a character. I think she's one of my favourite Dickensian heroines. She's a really fantastic and well-developed character, and the plot of Little Dorrit is so interesting too. It's such a great Dickens book, and definitely one I recommend. At number 7, I have The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope. This is a truly amazing novel. It is the 5th book in the Barsetshire Chronicles. You should read the other 4 books before you read this, but I still have to shout its praises because it is so truly amazing. This tells the story of 2 sisters, Lily and Belle Dale. They are very different. Belle is more sensible and quiet and reserved, and Lily wears her heart on her sleeve more. This book follows their romantic relationships. In some ways, I've said before that I think of it as a little bit of a kind of take on Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, in that it has that similar setup with 2 very different sisters and their kind of complicated romantic relationships. But what I really love about The Small House at Allington, as well as the writing and the characterization, as well as Trollope's consistent and ready wit, the amazing characterization of Lily Dale and Johnny Eames and Belle and all of the rest of the characters around them. What I really love about The Small House at Allington is the ending. The ending is perfection, and it is amazing, and it is so good, and I don't know how to explain how good it is without spoiling the novel, so I'm just gonna say I love the ending of this book so much. And this book I loved the whole way through, and then I read the ending and I just like wept on a plane, and I was just so like emotionally impacted and so in awe of the ending of this book. I love it so much. At number 6, I have Olive by Diana Mullet Craik. I read this a couple of years ago and just absolutely fell in love with it. This is a novel which in some ways I think has a lot of similarities to Jane Eyre. If you like Jane Eyre, I think you'll like Olive. It tells the story of our character Olive from her childhood into her adulthood. Olive is born with a problem with her spine, which means she doesn't look like other girls, and growing up she is told by the people around her that she will never get married, that she will never have children, because no one will want to marry her. She is told that her life is going to be different from what is expected for a Victorian woman in this time. And we follow her from her childhood into her adulthood, and we follow what she does decide to do with her life. It is such an amazing novel. It is a brilliant exploration of disability in the Victorian period, but it's also a fantastic coming of age story. And also, like Jane Eyre and like Valet, it's a story about claiming happiness and a life for yourself, and Olive saying, I deserve a life as much as everyone else around me. Okay, we need to calm down now. It's so good. It's so good, guys. It's just truly amazing, and I loved it, and I was so astounded by it. It's beautifully written, it's incredibly compelling, the characterization and the message of this book is so good, and I just utterly adored it. Yeah. It was just amazing. One of those books that just completely blew me away. I've only read it once and I'm just so excited for when I get to reread it because it was just absolutely amazing. At number 5, I have Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This is a fantastic novel that I absolutely love. I know it's a bit of a Marmite book, but I just think it's incredible. It is set in the middle of nowhere in the Yorkshire moors, and it tells a story specifically of kind of two different families. The Earnshaws, who live at a place called Wuthering Heights, and the Lintons, who live at a place called Thrushcross Grange. They are the two big primary families in the neighbourhood. And then into the midst of these two families appears a young boy called Heathcliff, who is adopted by the Earnshaw family. No one really knows where he came from, but he is going to disrupt the lives of everyone. And the book is basically about what happens to Heathcliff and his quest for revenge for the mistreatment he suffers. I love Wuthering Heights so much. It is often pitched as an amazing love story. Personally, I do not read it as a love story. I read it as a tale of revenge, and I've always found that reading it as a tale of revenge makes me love it much more and makes me understand it much more, I think. There are so many things I love about Wuthering Heights, from all the detestable, amazingly horrible characters to the fantastic plot, from all the doubling that takes place between one generation to the next generation of these families, from the callous treatment of death in this book to the supernatural atmosphere that persists throughout this novel. Or another thing that I love about Wuthering Heights is the amazing narrative structure where we have a story within a story within a story. I love it so much. It's so complicated, so bizarre, and I just completely adore it. It is fantastic. At number 4, I have Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Before I talk about this novel, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the last time I made a video about my favourite Victorian novels back in 2016, I mentioned Wives and Daughters, and Wives and Daughters was number 20. Since then I have reread it twice and it's moved from number 20 to number 4. This book is so good, and it's even better on a reread, and it's one of those books that I read as a teenager, forgot how much I loved it, reread it again a few years ago and was just blown away. Wives and Daughters tells the story of Molly Gibson, who is a doctor's daughter growing up in a small town. Her mother died at a young age, and her and her father have lived their lives happily together until one day when Molly is 16 or 17, her father decides that she needs a womanly influence in her life and decides to remarry. And suddenly into Molly's life appears a stepmother and a stepsister. The stepsister is of the same age as her, and we follow in the book their very complicated relationship, as well as Molly's complicated relationship with her stepmother, and also Molly's friendship with a family who live nearby called the Hamleys. It's a coming of age story in many ways, but it's also a story about family. It's a love story. It is a fantastic story about life in small towns. It's a book about grief and reputation and the position of women in the Victorian period and finding yourself. It's about so many things, and I adore it so much. Molly Gibson as a character is so fantastic and so well developed and so well rounded. Her stepsister Cynthia is fantastically complex, as is her stepmother Hyacinth, who sometimes I hate and sometimes I completely understand. I love Roger, I love Osborne, I love Mr. Gibson, I love every single character in this book. There is no character in this book I love more than Squire Hamley, who I genuinely think might be the best written character in any novel that I have ever read, in terms of his complicated psychology and the realism of him as a person. He is just fantastically drawn and amazing, and yeah, this book is so good. At number 3, we have Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens, another truly fantastic novel. This book is not about Mr. Dombey, and it is not about Mr. Dombey's son. It is in fact about Mr. Dombey's daughter. Florence Dombey grows up knowing that she is not valued by her father. Her father cares only about his business, Dombey and Son, so he cares about his son who is going to take over his business one day, but he has no time for girls at all. He does not care about his daughter. And this book follows Florence's life growing up, her complicated relationship with her father, and her tender relationship with her brother, and her relationship with all of the other characters that she meets. It is a book in many ways about gender, a book about marriage and family and the complexities within it. It is a social critique novel that is really at its heart criticising what little value Victorian society places on women and girls. I love so many things about this book. It has some of the most moving scenes in all of Dickens and some of the most complicated and interesting characters, from the bizarre Mr. Toots to the hilarious Susan Nipper to the tricky and cold, isolated Mr. Dombey to kind Florence, and not forgetting to mention my favourite character in this book, Edith, who is just one of the most amazing female characters in all of Dickens, and some of her speeches about the problem of the position of women within Victorian society, what's wrong with Victorian marriage, just amazing, amazing. It is so good. At number 2, my second favourite Victorian novel and my second favourite book of all time is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. I love Gaskell, she is so great. This is my favourite love story of all time, but it's also a wonderful social critique novel that really fantastically explores society and industrialisation and the complexity of industrial life in the mid-Victorian period. It tells the story of a young woman called Margaret Hale who has grown up in the rural South. Her father is a clergyman, and one day her father decides to leave the church and uproot her and her mother to live in the industrial town of Milton Northern. And Margaret moves to this mill town where everything is different, where there seems to be strife and difficulty all around her. And there she befriends workers who work in the mills, and also comes to know her father's friend, Mr. Thornton, who is a factory owner. And there is a little bit of a complicated relationship between them, as well as so many other things going on in this book. This is a book about industrialisation. It is a social critique novel at its heart, but it's also a great love story, a great book about death, which sounds weird, but trust me, Elizabeth Gaskell really knows how to write about grief. There are so many things I love about this book. I think it is truly fantastic and just absolutely beautiful, and I love the way it explores industrialisation in the mid-19th century. I love the way it looks at the complicated relationships between masters and men. I love how we see these issues from multiple sides. There is just so much in this book that I completely adore. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's clever, it's smart. It is fascinating and readable and just utterly beautiful. I cannot recommend it enough. I just completely adore it. But at number 1, my favourite Victorian novel, and of course my favourite book of all time, is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. I know I go on about this book on this channel a lot, but it is fantastic. This book is Dickens's last finished novel, and it tells the story of a particular fortune and all of the people who are connected by this fortune. A man called Old Mr. Harmon makes a money in dust, in sorting through rubbish and finding things that are worth value amongst the dust. And after his death, his money is due to go to his son, who is living abroad. His son travels back, and on the way back is found drowned. We follow all of the people who are affected by this murder and by the fortune and what happens to it afterwards, through lots of twisting events, and everyone who is drawn together in complicated ways by this money. I love this book so much. I love the way it explores money and class in Victorian society. I love the way it looks at gender. I love the way it looks at family. I love the way it looks at social mobility and class and respectability. I love the characterisation in this. It has some of my favourite characters in all of Dickens, from Bradley Headstone, who is Dickens's most nuanced and complicated villain / anti-hero, to Jenny Wren, who is just one of those amazing characters, full of life, full of energy, full of independence and spirit, to Lizzie Hexam and Bella Wilfer, 2 of my favourite female characters in all of Dickens, to the Boffins, who are just so wonderful and so brilliantly drawn, or the moody and southern Eugene Rayburn, whose dialogue is just fantastic. There are so many amazing characters in Our Mutual Friend. There are so many things about it that I love, and I just completely adore it. I reread it earlier this year, listening to it on audiobook, and it was just wonderful to rediscover it and remember how much I completely adore this book. It was the first Dickens book I ever read. It got me into Dickens. It is such a brilliant book, and I cannot recommend it enough. So yeah, there we have it. Those are my favourite 25 Victorian novels. I hope this video did not go on for an age, but I love all of these books a lot and I really wanted to talk about all of them, so, you know, there we go. Thank you so much for watching and bearing with me to the end of this very long list. Please let me know down in the comments what your favourite Victorian novels are. I would be very interested to know. And if you've read any of these books or if you haven't read them but you want to now, please do let me know as well. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.